Welcome back. I'm Shane, and this is Relative Time. So I've been doing this for about 3 years now, and while it's definitely a lot of work, there are some great benefits to running a channel. One of the coolest and unique benefits is getting a chance to see a lot of prototypes before they're put into production. But one of the downsides to that is that I don't always get a chance to look at the final production models. And when I do, I haven't really been showing them off on the channel. Now, last month, I just happened to get 2 watches that are the final production models of watches that I'd previously reviewed as prototypes. So I thought I'd briefly show them off and talk about some of the changes that were made, because that is one of the coolest things about microbrands and this whole process, that they really are paying attention to what I'm saying and what you guys are saying in comments, and sometimes changes can be made to affect the overall design. Now, this is more of a quick take on each of these, and if you don't remember the full review or just want to watch it again, I'll have links below in the description. So first we're going to take a look at the Midnight Blue Successor from 9-4 Watches, and then the Pastel Blue Gin Clear Diver from Second Hour Watches. And both of those are pretty much a mouthful to say. Now, some of you may have noticed the sponsored content tag at the beginning, and that's there because 9-4 did give me this watch. I reviewed the prototype back in February and hadn't really heard much from them since, but last month they reached out and just said they wanted to thank me for helping them to identify some areas to improve. And as for the Gin Clear, well, that's one I bought by jumping on the Kickstarter just like everyone else. But let's really get started with the Successor, and I'll quickly flash the specs up on the screen. The big one to pay attention to there is total thickness, as this is rather thin for an automatic with a Seiko NH35A. Now first off, this is a different colorway from what I reviewed. The prototype was of the black dial, and while that black dial is pretty cool, this is just gorgeous. Especially when the light hits that sunburst dial just right with these vertical grooves. And as a side note, I think there are 2 more colorways of this coming. A royal blue version and an Arctic white. Although I think that Arctic white one's going to be a big hit with Dodger fans. Yet considering 9-4 is from Milwaukee, I think they should do a green dial version for the Bucks and Packer fans out there. Now in terms of changes, well, the first thing I noticed is the logo. It was originally painted on, and just kind of looks so-so. While here it's nicely applied, and looks great against the blue. The design itself is still the same, and I know some people really didn't like it. But recently I did notice on Instagram that they proposed a new logo. So that won't go on this one, but maybe future watches. The second thing I noticed with this is the hands. They've been changed to be a bit more sword-shaped, with a much more defined point at the end, as well as a more 3D defined angular shape, which I think that is a real positive, as the previous ones were pretty flat. The crown is about the same size, which is still a tad small, but the shape has been changed and that does make it a lot easier to get a hold of. They say the overall finishing has also been improved, yet the case doesn't seem too different to me, and there still are some sharper edges on the bottom. But I think the bracelet seems more refined. Now, unfortunately, the bracelet is still integrated, but it is a fantastic bracelet. And that was one thing I definitely remembered from the prototype. With all the smaller, fully articulating links, it can really conform and hug your wrist, just giving you a great and comfortable feel. Although I think the biggest improvement I saw was on the finishing of the dial. The macro shots on the prototype were a bit on the rough side. Well, everything here looks much cleaner and much more well-defined. And lastly, the other big improvement was to the loom. Loom on the prototype was something I mentioned a few times in the review, as it was just sad. Basically, just blinking out and not even able to keep up with a Vostok. But here is a big improvement. It easily outlasts that same Vostok and is able to hold its own against a turtle, at least for a bit. It's still not quite as good as that Seiko, but a huge improvement, and pretty good overall for a casual sports watch. And that's an improvement you can even see during the day, as the indices have a faint green glow to them now, and I think that looks particularly cool against the sunburst blue. Now let's move on to the Gin Clear, and again I'll briefly throw up the specs. Not a ton of changes here, as the prototype was pretty good, and that was one of the reasons I jumped on the Kickstarter. Yet there have been a number of small refinements here. I had a hard time deciding which colorway I wanted, but ultimately I went with the same one I looked at before. There's just something fascinating about this pastel blue, and it's not a color you see all the time. But one change I did make was to go with a stainless steel bezel rather than the black ceramic, which I think makes a striking difference in the presence. Now let's start by talking about some of the smaller changes to the dial. One of the things is that the brand name is now in caps, and the controversial underline that was on the prototype has now been removed. I really don't remember why that was such a big deal. It never quite bothered me, but there were quite a few comments about that underline. There was also some minor changes to the text on the bottom, but nothing really major. And for the most part, the loom here is the same, at least on the dial. The loom was already pretty good, so that's not a big surprise, but more loom has been added to the bezel. There's also been some minor refinements to the crown, making it slightly longer so that it is easier to unscrew. And the edge of the bezel has more of a straighter edge to it, where they took out a bevel that was at the top. And this again makes it easier to grab and use. So most of the changes are pretty minor, and the only big change is the addition of a chamfered edge along each lug. That edge isn't overly wide, but I think it adds a bit of flash, and helps the case by highlighting the overall outline. But that's pretty much it for the Gin Clear. It's still a very well made and pretty cool diver, and I still find myself drawn to the slightly unusual dial design, with extended indices at the 12, 4, and 8. So that about wraps us up. And I'll throw up some links if you do want to see the original reviews of the 9.4 Successor or the Second Hour Watch's Gin Clear Diver. And if you happen to be interested, I think 9.4 is going to get more inventory in pretty soon. And I think Second Hour is still taking pre-orders for the second run of the Gin Clear. But in the meantime, make sure you let me know down below what you think about these two watches. And if you enjoyed the video, you all know what to do down below. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you again soon.